So everybody uses hopefully dozens of passwords, because if you don't, it means that you're probably relying on the same password or two over and over and over again, which even if you've got a really good password, if your site gets compromised, or if any one of those sites you're using that password gets compromised, say they're storing the passwords in plain text, which the IEEE did for a while, just recently they got broken into, in fact. That means that if an attacker can get that password and they can guess on some services like, say, Gmail that are high target, or even banking, if they can get your username and password that you always use, they'll have your passwords to every account. So just saying, well, I've got one large password that I use in a bunch of places, or even 3 or 4 that I rotate through and I've used in a bunch of places, doesn't really work. So that brings us to the topic of password management, which is all about managing a whole bunch of different passwords. So the basics of passwords, they perform authentication across a broad range of applications. So like I mentioned, banking, Gmail, but also logging into your computer. So you like I said, you probably have dozens of accounts that use that to authenticate you. Possibly just in a given day, at UH alone, there's probably 6 different accounts that all have different passwords that you're required to know. So aside from serving as just a way to authenticate a user, it can serve as a seed for encryption. Encryption is a topic we'll be getting into soon, but basically it can do a couple different things. It can be used as a key expander, which is usually how it is used, which is just when you take it and feed it into some sort of random number generator that gives you a whole bunch of extra output, and it will consistently do that. So when you come back to decrypt your file, that is, it'll expand it to the same key, which the key should be non-repeating, so it needs to be the length of the data, which is why that matters. And of course, a password may not even actually authenticate you. It may just be that you know a password and you enter it. So that's sort of authentication, but because you never identified yourself, it's a little bit more questionable as to whether it's actual authentication. So to store passwords, this is going a little bit off topic, but I think it'd be interesting because it's still fairly related. To store passwords, the site or system that you're entering a password into, they should be storing it in what's called a hash. And a hash is the result of a one-way function. So basically, it's really expensive for an attacker to reverse a good hash. And again, hashes are usually, when you use them with passwords, hashes are generally called cryptographic hashes. So we'll be covering those again when we hit the cryptography presentation. So I'm not going to go into detail of that here. Unfortunately, this isn't often the case, which is why I got into the you have to have a whole bunch of different passwords. Otherwise, the loss of one, or the compromise of one site may compromise a whole bunch of different sites. In a system with plain text passwords, then, as I said, if the passwords may get leaked if the site is hacked. So password creation, here are some best practices for what your password should be like. A good password needs to be at least 15 characters, and it should be alphanumeric, and you should have special symbols. Alphanumeric needs to include both upper and lowercase letters as well as numbers. A password should never be repeated on 2 systems. I've already talked about that a little bit. If a system stores the password incorrectly and it is compromised, then both systems are compromised as a result, should the first one get. No predictable pattern should exist to relate different passwords together, because if an attacker is able to get 2 or 3 sites, which is not actually that uncommon, and they see all your passwords, and they see only minor variations, they can probably do a brute force attack. Well, it's not really brute force at that point. They can do an attack that will guess your password much quicker than if they had to do a brute force attack. Passwords should be updated every few months, and they need to remain distinct from both your current and your past passwords. So as you guys can begin to see, keeping track of all your passwords is a very painful process. So there's a variety of different password management schemes because it's impossible to memorize them if you do it well, unless you're really good at memorizing things. So there's basically 2 different types of password management schemes: the use of a non-deterministic algorithm to aid the memorization of passwords, and the use of software to track, create, and maintain passwords meeting the specifications. So the first type approach of using a non-deterministic algorithm for password memorization is what I call keeping it in your head, which is you literally generate that password. The first one, you literally generate the password and you memorize it. I left that one off, but that would just be I memorize everything because I can. The second one is passphrases. These are long and memorable phrases that take the place of a password. I'm a little bit iffy as to how comfortable I am with that process, because unless you do it just right, I'm a bit concerned that you're going to end up leaving yourself vulnerable to a different form of dictionary attack. A dictionary attack, by the way, is a brute force that feeds in a dictionary list that just says, here's a whole bunch of different combinations that seem likely. Another one is replacement of characters. This is something you see a lot. You take a memorable password and you replace in characters. You can also use that variation with a passphrase. So you're just replacing, say, the letter A with an @ symbol. So symbols that look similar, numbers that look similar. Also not very secure because it turns out most people do this in a fairly predictable way, and so an attacker can just guess everything. It really depends on how good you do it. Any of these password methods, if they're long enough and they're not predictable, can be secure. Password Haystacks, this was created by Steve Gibson. They select a fixed password, so it remains the same across all sites. And they generate a random number of selected character to pad the password in one or more locations. I go into detail of what that looks like in a slide or two. So, passphrases. Like I said, they need to be composed of a lengthy and nonsensical phrase. The good things. They're easy to remember because they're similar to a mnemonic. Done correctly, they present a high degree of entropy, which is just randomness. It makes it hard to guess. And finally, assuming that they are related between systems, they are hard to guess or crack. The downsides. They become overwhelming if you have a lot of passphrases. So if you have 30 passphrases, you have to remember you're bound to forget one at some point. They require you to come up with a random passphrase every time you need to create a new password. It can be a bit of a strain if you're sitting there and you need it right now because the login system, say UAHs, requires you to reset. Of course, that only allows 12 characters, so you couldn't actually do a random passphrase anyway. That's long enough to be worth anything. And finally, as I said, it requires you to memorize a lot of passphrases. All right, then there's replacement of characters. I think I summed this up pretty well. They're easy to remember. They're a slight improvement over just a basic password that's easy to remember. And like I said, the cons, they're easy to predict. A lot of cracking dictionaries already have them. For short passwords, they're still easy to brute force. And they still require the memorization of a distinct password for every system to be secure. And finally, password haystacks. Like I mentioned, they're created by Steve Gibson, who is, by the way, a security researcher. He does a podcast called Security Now, which I listen to when I have time. Each system has the same password with a different number of symbols. So I've got an example there, cat. I've expanded out. I've used @ symbols to pad it, and it expanded out. So each system would have a different variation of the padding like that. The pros are this can be easy to remember, and it increases the length of the password rapidly, which makes it hard to break. The cons, well, it has a lower amount of entropy because you're using a pattern. If the attacker figures out this pattern, then the protection is much easier to guess because they can just start trying different variations of padding. And finally, it still requires you to remember the variations of the password for every site, which might actually be even harder than some of the other mechanisms because it means that I have to remember, well, how many @ symbols did I put on Google? How many @ symbols did I use at UAH? Password management software. This is the one, of course, I want everybody to go for because, well, it makes your life a lot easier. This is a better alternative to trying to memorize all your passwords. Good password management software should be encrypted with the best encryption algorithms. Now that, in general terms, is AES, that's Advanced Encryption Standard 256-bit. You might not be able to get that because there are export restrictions from going out of the US, which means a lot of companies don't actually use 256-bit encryption if they made it in the US. These should generate random passwords for you. That means you don't have to go create that password. You can actually go click a button and it will generate entropy for you. Well, actually, you generate the entropy because, take for example, KeyPass, which is what I use. It'll literally accept waving your cursor around randomly and entering keys. And it'll take that and it'll use those random inputs to seed its random number generators. And finally, it should be portable across multiple platforms and devices because if you want to be able to log into stuff from your phone, you need to be able to do it. If you use Linux and Windows, it needs to work across both those. Password management software, first example is KeyPass. It's a free and open source password manager. It's what I use still. There's one I'm looking at porting to, but I haven't yet. It's available on Linux, Windows, and Android, and there's also an iPhone version. It's not official. I've not used it because I wouldn't touch an iPhone. The database is encrypted by 128-bit AES or Twofish. Twofish is an alternative to AES. It's pretty much just as strong. AES was actually picked by a competition, and Twofish was one of the runners-up, the really high runners-up. It was created by Bruce Schneier, who, if you were here in one of the previous presentations, he's somebody who's going to show up all the time if you get into security. He's pretty much the top expert, at least in the US, probably in the world, in security. He's one of those people who's written a lot of books. Smart guy. It does generate the passwords, so you can use user input to increase the entropy. It stores sensitive data while running and processing. It stores the sensitive data used while running in process memory. So that encrypted while in process memory. So what that means is normally when you have a key loaded into memory or a password loaded into memory, it's not encrypted, which means if an attacker gets in there, they can really easily get to it. It's really easy to spot, and it's directly pullable. Now this, of course, still, you can't prevent an attacker who's really determined from getting this out of memory, because they could go find where the key to that encryption is stored, but this makes it harder. Basically, if there's somebody who doesn't know what they're doing and they just look for random data and they find it and they pull it down, that doesn't actually work. And the newer versions, which are 2.x and 2.0 and newer, they actually have protection against keyloggers. This is actually really interesting what they did. What they did is they multiplex in two inputs when you click what's called auto type, which just fills in a form for you. It uses both simulated key presses and cutting and pasting from the clipboard. So in other words, to attack that, you would have to both have a keylogger and have access to the clipboard and know what times things are being pasted in and what times they're being typed in. So it's a really nifty feature that I don't know of any other ones using it, but this is the main one I use, so I'm not as familiar with other alternatives. So the pros are it's portable across the major platforms, Android, Linux, and Windows. I think there's a Mac version too. I don't remember. I meant to have that on there. It's secure against many attacks. You only have to remember one master password. Windows versions actually integrate with the web browser, so most of what you're going to store is, of course, going to be websites, because that's what most of our passwords are usually these days. So you have a little plug-in, and it'll actually autofill in the forms for you. The downside is you have to keep the database file with you at all times. Oh, there's one thing I forgot. There's also a portable version, so you can run it off a flash drive, so you can take it around with you with the file. So the downside is it requires you to keep the database file with you at all times, so you have to make sure if you want to go move from computer to computer, you've got that on, say, a USB drive. It's not compatible with multi-factor authentication. So I've got a little device with me that I'll show you guys later called YubiKey, and there's also stuff like the RSA smart cards and things like that. It can't do that. It can use key files, so you could say store a file on a different USB drive and open it up, and that adds to your security. It means you could use a shorter password as long as you had a lot of files, and that made it hard to find it, but not as good as true multi-factor. The Linux, Android, and iPhone versions are still all on the 1X line, which means that they do not have that special key logging protections. All right, so another alternative, which is also fairly popular, and it's really nifty in some respects, is called LastPass. This is commercial software, and it's not totally open source. It's been evaluated by a number of security experts, so you're probably pretty safe on this. This is actually what I got my parents to use. The file is stored in the cloud. This is, of course, questionable because there's always this risk that someone gets it, they download it, and they perform a huge number of brute force attacks on it. But honestly, as long as you use a good password, if someone can break the encryption they're using on it, because it's 256 AES, if someone can break that when you're using a good password on it, they can hack into your computer and all that anyway, and pretty much anything else. It's really expensive to break 256-bit AES. Anyway, LastPass has a larger range of devices supported. It includes Apple entirely. It includes the BlackBerry. Pretty much everything out there that's major enough for them to support, they're supporting. It functions as a browser plugin to all major browsers, so Firefox, Internet Explorer, Chrome, Opera. There's a free version. There's also a $12 a year version. I talk about that in a second, so I'll wait. The master password is turned into the encryption key after many rounds of hashing. Memory serves its 50 rounds of hashing, which means an attacker who's trying to use rainbow tables, it's still really expensive. Rainbow tables are, by the way, a pre-computed dictionary of hashes. We'll probably get into that at some point in the future. The premium version can actually generate one-time keys, so you use them once, you throw them away. You can stick those in fold it up in your wallet and use them to access it at a public terminal, and that way your master password doesn't get compromised should there be, say, a keylogger installed. Finally, the premium version supports a YubiKey, which is a multi-factor authentication device, which I will show you guys later, so I won't go into detail on it right now.
Do you know what the premium version costs?
$12 a year.
Oh, $12 is the premium.
Yeah, there's a free version and a premium version. That's all they've got. It's really not bad for that price, at least in my opinion. So the pros, like I said, it's portable across all major platforms. It's nice because it uses what we like to say in the cloud. I don't totally trust the cloud, but in this case, as I said, as long as you're using a good password to authenticate it, you're probably okay. And what this means is if you forget your USB drive with your physical drive, you can still get on to LastPass if you need it. It's heavily encrypted, in fact, significantly better than KeePass because it's using 256-bit AES rather than 128-bit AES, which means that there's probably a good 10 to 20 years before it's weakened enough to where you have to worry about it. Encryption, by the way, ages out over time. It supports multi-factor authentication for accessing the database. Like I said, the YubiKeys is developed by a very security-conscious company. They had one time where there was a minor breach. It didn't look like anything got taken. It was just like something out in the DMZ probably. And they immediately went and they reset all the passwords. They increased the number of times it took to do the hashes. They were very responsive, which is not something you see out of every company, so it's actually a pretty good sign. Which it might just be because they're a small company that makes them more responsive. And the downside is, as I said, it stores them online, which freaks some of us out. And unfortunately right now, it doesn't work all that well with applications outside of the web browser. I believe there is an application that you can launch that is still in beta, but normally you would have to open up your web browser, go to it, find the password, and click on it. It works great in the web browser. It's pretty much seamless, but oh boy, using it for an application, much harder. So here's a couple alternatives. I'll cover these very briefly because our next presentation is actually on multi-factor authentication. There are two other forms of authentication. The first is biometrics. They're also called inherence factors, so technically there are other things, but biometrics is pretty much all you get. This is when you authenticate based on a physical attribute of the user. So that's like fingerprint scanning, retina scanners, stuff like that. It doesn't work very well. And then there's possession, which is when you authenticate an item based on an item in the user's possession. So that would be like the YubiKey. And of course, multiple forms of authentication can be used together to increase security. And finally, unless you have a small number of passwords, use a password manager. Possibly even then you should. Make sure that it encrypts your password database well and use a very strong master password. Remember, you only have one password to memorize now, so think along the lines of like 32, maybe even 64 characters if you've got the time to memorize that, which I don't. And of course, you should change that periodically, and you should also, if you're using something where you control the database, make sure you keep that database secured. Any questions?
I got here kind of late, obviously, but would you say that saving your passwords in an Excel file on your computer is dangerous?
Yes, unless you're encrypting it manually.
Is that basically what these password managers do?
They encrypt it. They also usually provide a few other functions like autotype and sometimes web browser integration. So they've got additional functionality, but you really don't want to be using Excel because that means if for whatever reason that file gets leaked, be it you get hacked, be it a friend comes and they see this file and they grab it, you're out of luck. Mm-hmm. All your passwords are now compromised.
It is unlikely, though, that your computer itself would be broken into, let's say...
Oh, I don't know about that. We're going to have a malware presentation soon that shows you how easy it is not only to break into stuff, but to authenticate it. Or, automate it. Okay. That's what, you've heard of worms, right? Right. So those are literally, they go around and they automatically attack systems. So if I were to make something that said, looks for your little, for something that looks like it's a password database of some sort, and I mean, we could put in a lot of things. Password dot asterisk so that it does a wide key, right? So we're just going to look for anything that says password in it, and we're going to download it to our server.
So you're saying like they would find the file, basically?
Yeah.
If they get access, they may find the file, yes. In other words, don't use an unencrypted file. You don't want to leave your passwords laying around. It would be like if I took a sheet of paper around with me and I left it on my desk. It means if somebody walks in, and remember too, it's not just hackers. If you loaned your computer to a friend and they find that, well, maybe they weren't really a good friend.
How safe would you say it is to just try and, let's say, memorize all your passwords, and in the likely event that you forget some, have them emailed to your email account?
Let me put it this way. Do you have hundreds on all your files?
No.
Then your memory ain't that good.
Right.
It's not.
That's what I mean.
The email.
It's likely that you're going to have it sent to your email.
Well, first off, to memorize a password that is really secure, it's really hard to do even one of those. So you're going to be doing those resets all the time.
Right. The
second thing with that is you got to keep in mind some of these password resets are very poorly done. Sometimes they will email you in a plain text email that password. So if I was sitting and sniffing internet traffic, which is not that hard to do, and I saw that password, I could snatch it and go log in and reset your password before you could. Suddenly you've lost control of your account again. And maybe while I'm in there, I managed to go change the settings so you can't get it back. If nothing else, I could do some nasty things. See, keep in mind, people say, oh, I don't need to secure my email. Right. But keep in mind, if you send a death threat, or somebody logged into your email and sends a death threat on your email, you may not go to jail in the end, but you may end up with legal troubles. This has happened before. Same things happen. Well, actually, it's happened mostly because of unencrypted wireless networks. It was a story where a guy across the street got ticked off with his neighbors, and he sent a death threat to the president. And the Secret Service showed up at their house. You don't want to be in that situation. Anyway, some of these topics are good future things. If you're interested in stuff like that, come talk to me, and I'll see what we can put together. You might have to help a bit, but